Ladies and gentlemen, today I have the pleasure to welcome Dr. Abari Cartman, and we're going to discuss about his book, Black Spirituality, Ancient Wisdom to Heal Generational Trauma. Dr. Abari, thank you very much for joining me on the Human Rights Tree.
Thank you, Brother Diallo, for the invitation and for your work and for, documenting conversations that matter to us. I appreciate
It's,
your work.
it's my pleasure. Today, basically, as I indicated, I invited you in this platform to talk about your book, Black Spirituality. But before we go into the topic, I would love to know who is Dr. Abari.
Great question. It's a question I am continuing to figure out as I'm unfolding and discovering and becoming and experiencing life in what feels like sometimes really distinct chapters. So the version of me now and hope maybe that will be different than the version of me that will be in chapters 50 and 70-year-old me. But I embrace that. I embrace discovery. I feel like part of our mission here in this phase of existence is to come here and to learn and to gather experiences and to share what we know as we are learning it. But I feel like I'm a being that's constantly evolving. Um, there are certain things that I would say are core principles so that whatever the iteration of me is, however it expresses itself, there's things that I would say are pretty consistent about who I am. And those things have always been around, been feeling more alive when I'm connected to people, when I'm serving, when I'm helping. I feel like I was destined to be a helper in some way. Um, but the way I help, I think, is also consistently connected to creativity, art, culture, as a form of medicine, tapping into sort of the best and brightest of humanity through creative arts, and then connecting that to service. I think has been consistent through the versions of the self that I've expressed. So I think that's a little bit about me.
Are you from Chicago?
Yeah, born and raised from Chicago, South Side. Moved to the suburbs when I was about teenagers, and then I left for college and grad school, and then came back.
What was your neighborhood in the South Side?
We were 89th and Bishop, so like Southeast.
Mm. How was it growing up as a
Um,
child in the South Side during your years of childhood?
I I give a lot of credit to my parents and the village they created around me as a child. I didn't realize that we were poor until I looked back at it, right? I didn't realize that we were in a so-called dangerous neighborhood until I go there now, right? Um, in my house, in my life, I always feel very safe, very protected. I come from a big family, so I have a lot of aunts and uncles. And for very early on, I was in like African-centered private schools. At the time, it was called New Concept Development Center, started by Baba Hakeem Madabudi and his wife, Safisha Madabudi, and a team of sort of really committed, dedicated Black Americans who were on their own journey to reclaim their sense of place and heritage and identity. My father was a part of that community. He changed his name from Anthony to Tabiti. You know, he started eating, clean and playing drums and celebrating Kwanzaa. And so he was doing that before I was born. And so I was born into his own transformation and got to benefit from him creating community around culture and heritage and identity that became my life. So I'm very much a product of my environment, very still connected to these communities that have shaped me. And so growing up as a child, my life, my memories have less to do with like being on the South Side as much as they have to do with being a part of this cultural community that, you know, shaped me and continues to shape me. Um, So my childhood was very vibrant. We played drums and we're always at community festivals and community events. And like my name was a response to Black folk at the time trying to like reinterrogate who we are at our core and how to pull pieces of these fragments of this lost sense of self and culture and merge them together in some semblance of form that made sense for them at the time, which include names, which included, diet, religion to a certain degree, which is what brought me to this conversation. I grew up in a house where we did go to church, went to an AME church on the South Side. And my father was more struggling with like the impact of this question of the colonized religion versus Christianity being something that Black people took over and reclaimed for ourselves and had our own expression of, versus like just throwing the whole thing away because it was a bastardized version of a religion that was imposed on our ancestors. And so my mother was still very much connected to what her grandmother and her grandmother was connected to, which was Christianity in the form that she knew it. And so we grew up in church, but also I had my father kind of like nagging in the background, um, not necessarily anti it, but not embracing it. So that question was always a part of my upbringing. This like, who are we? Who am I? Like I love you started with the question, who am I? This is something that I've always been wrestling with beyond my own personal likes, dislikes, talents, gifts, but like who am I in the context of my people? Who am I in the context of a collective? And how do we figure those questions out in a country that is still a very much a foreign land, but still home, but still distorted and, you know, and deliberately removing aspects of our culture because of their power, but then us trying to put those things back together, but doing it across a diaspora that we didn't have a specific connection to. And so then this becomes this piecemeal thing. And then there's questions of authenticity and these questions of um, like belonging have always been around. They've always been a part of my upbringing, my family,
Mm.
and continue to be a part of my work.
As you indicated, um, as a child, you grow up if in a Afrocentric village.
Hmm.
For the people who really don't know what is an Afrocentric village, what are the pillar of a Afrocentric village?
So I can describe the school. So we every day in school we started out, we had a uniform. It was red, black, and green. The red, black, and green came from the Pan-African flag that was given to us by Marcus Garvey during his movement of um, sort of a go back home, a diasporic connection. The red represented the connecting blood of African people, African descendants around the world. The black represented sort of the racial conversations that we were having, and the green represented the land of Africa. So we always considered this homage to the motherland being our sacred home, even though we were like displaced, lost citizens of that home. And so every time I would wake up as a child and put this uniform on, I was aware that I was representing a Pan-African flag that had a meaning to it that, maybe as a child I didn't fully grasp, but it was shaping me nonetheless. We never did the Pledge of Allegiance. We had our own pledge, right? Every day we do it. It starts school in a circle and we would do a pledge. Maybe you can remember some of it. We are African people struggling for national liberation. We are preparing leaders and workers to bring about the consciousness of our people. Can right? So there's elements of this that we sang a song. There was drums, and so some of the principles that are represented in the activities, the rituals of the day were unity, um, or the Nguzo Saba, which are the seven principles of Kwanzaa created by Malala Karenga back in the 60s, 70s, represented some of those guiding principles. Ma'at is a series of principles from Kemet. We also might know as Egypt, so ancient sort of guiding principles that are still etched in the stones of pyramids became these guiding principles of the foundations of the house and in the schools and the communities that we belong to. So when we say African centered, it is a an attempt to look across the diaspora of Africa, giant continent, but looking for the common values and principles that we could see from afar that represented the essence of what it meant to be an African person. So we use the Nguzo Saba as a guiding principle. Those seven principles are Umoja, for these Swahili words out of East Africa, sort of a composite language, Swahili. Umoja, which meant unity, Kujichagulia, which meant self-determination, Ujima, collective work and responsibility, Ujamaa, cooperative economics, Nia, purpose, Kaumba, creativity, and Imani, faith. So those are some guiding, like very specific guiding principles. My aunt, I mentioned, there's sort of, I think maybe 40 or so, truth, justice, order. So these are where the guiding principles of our school. We learned about Malcolm X and Marcus Garvey and Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth. And so while other schools were teaching Christopher Columbus, we were learning, you know, um, Denmark Vesey, right?
Mm.
So part of it is just the focus on the people and the places of our ancestry that were positive historical contributions to the world that were often neglected in the sort of majority public schools, and also participating in the rituals. So we were singing African songs in different languages and playing djembe. We were, doing sort of the circle ritual, sort of connecting to this expression of unity through the formation. Um, I remember not having like the same grade system. I can't remember exactly what it was, but like it wasn't ABC, right? So it was a really complete reinterrogation of what the education system was about. What is the goal of teach? What do we teach our young people? How do we express ourselves? All of the teachers were wearing dashikis or some type of African print. They would have natural hair. So it was that was the African centered village that I grew up in. And so when I went to school, I didn't have some of the same challenges of feeling ostracized or feeling like the curriculum wasn't for me. It was all Black African diasporic. It was just like pouring into the meat of the like the center, the core of who people are. So and I benefited from that greatly. And we're still very connected to my classmates and teachers from that time. So part of the community, the it takes a village idea extended throughout my life.
I see. When you come to the school, what
Mhm.
were the different level? Were it elementary, high school,
Yep.
or was it
They
only
use
elementary school?
it was just elementary school at the time.
I see.
And then they expanded to eighth grade. It's a charter school now called Betty Shabazz and Barbara Sizemore. So it's expanded and grown, and they still have the new concept, I think, for the preschool levels. Um, but it still exists. My children went to that school,
I see.
right? And so it's become a family legacy. So
So as a child going through that form of education
mhm.
and curriculum, how was how how challenging was it for you to integrate the public, the formal curriculum that you have around you?
Not difficult at all. We were above grade. I ended up leaving that school. I was there from, I think we call it kindergarten Pampanua. I think that's the Swahili for kindergarten. So I was there from maybe pre-K through second grade. At the time, it only went up to third grade. We ended up moving, and I went going to a sort of a public school, and I remember coming in higher than my peers, like
Mm.
just intellectually. So it wasn't just about the culture, but like the academics were rigorous. And then we moved out to the suburbs. And so it was like the culture was strange, being one, two, three, maybe Black kids in a room full of white kids. But I didn't feel uncomfortable. Like I always felt like I belonged because my foundation was secure. And so I felt like I could adapt. I felt like I was intelligent enough. I remember my mother had to fight when I was maybe like sixth grade to keep me in the honors programs. because the teachers didn't think I was capable because they see the little black kid from the South Side coming out, but like I knew the stuff and I could keep up. And so that foundation, I think, has propelled me throughout school because I always loved learning. Like my first experience with education was something that felt comfortable and affirming. And so wherever I was from kindergarten through PhD, I could always connect it to who we are and make it meaningful because that was my first experience. And so it wasn't like a challenge. Like even going from I went to HBCU, right? So I would go back and forth from all black experiences, and then I went to a PWI, primarily white institution for graduate school. So there was moments when it was like a shift, but it wasn't a shock. And I think it was because my foundation, my connection to education was always affirming because of my early experiences.
I see. Where did you go to college, and what was your subject? Which
I went to
subject did you?
Hampton,
Where
Hampton
is that?
University, that's in Virginia.
Okay.
So it's a historically black college,
Mm.
university. And I studied psychology out there. So I've been doing psychology since then.
Did you always, have the inspiration to be a psychologist?
I did ever
Or
since I was in like middle school. I remember I was a part of like the peer mediators. I was always doing clubs that were talking about social issues and connecting with peers. We would do retreats all the time. So I was always doing stuff around like thinking and learning and listening and helping. I was always that was always a part of me. So when I took a psychology class my senior year in high school, I was like, this is it. This is the stuff I've always loved to do. I love like my friends would always come to me with their problems. I was always mediating conflicts. I was always trying to think about why people did what they did. I was always very curious about people. And so psychology just gave me the form to be able to express that. I didn't really know what I wanted to do with it, but I knew I could keep studying and digging into the curiosity about how humans work. And so psychology was always it for me.
I see. Obviously, you decided you want to write a book,
Hmm.
and you call it Black Spirituality. Um, why you decide that you needed to write a book?
Um, the beginning of the inspiration to write the book happened because even as I describe sort of this African-centered cultural upbringing, um, the way it shaped in Chicago, at least in my experience of it, was still separate from African spiritual understandings. Um, I think that to the extent that I understood that we were connected to ancestors and had a technology that could allow us to communicate with ancestors and to listen to and to be guided by, um, we're doing the pouring of libations before we would do ceremonies. And so I was very familiar with that idea that before we would do Kwanzaa ceremonies or before we would even do like graduations, some of the elders would pour water onto a plant and would talk about and would invoke the names of community ancestors, ask us to name family ancestors, talk about some of the sort of stalwart ancestors from Black communities. Um, and so I was very familiar with this idea that there's cycles of life, that you pour water into a plant to represent this life and death. But it was always symbolic. It was this, it's kind of like you would wear Rosa Parks on the t-shirt. Like it was just idea that you remember those people who came before us. We stand on the shoulders of giants. That was the extent of my spiritual sense that Africa had something really valuable to contribute to this conversation about spirit. It wasn't until I became an adult that I bumped into people who were deeply studying different spiritual traditions through ancient Kemetic spirituality, All-Star All-Set community here in Chicago. Um, and even later than that, I found people who were studying the Yoruba system, Ifa,
Mm,
and I kind of just fell into it. In hindsight, I think about like divine inspiration and intervention and being guided to places. But it was because I was good at playing West African djembes and I grew up in companies playing that, that a friend of mine invited me to a ceremony to play Orisha music. Orisha are the gods and deities of the Yoruba system. Um, and so a friend asked me to come drum for a ceremony because they needed some drummers for the songs and the dance. And I was like, I don't know that stuff. I don't know that music. I wasn't uncomfortable with the idea. I didn't want to go mess up some ceremony that I didn't know nothing about. Um, but she offered to pay and I needed the money. And so I ended up going to a ceremony that became an entree point for me being immersed in this ritual that was just felt so familiar, so like home. It felt like I was being transported into another time and a place, and it just the music and everything kind of just fit. It just felt like I've been doing this and need to continue to do this. And so that was my entry point. Like I was as a drummer came into the EFI system, the Orisha system, and just became deeply curious. You know, the things that I was seeing, I was, watching people get mounted by different gods and we're speaking in plain like conversation. And I was like, there's no explanation. There's no scientific understanding that could help me understand how spirit is moving and operating in these rituals that I was just able to observe as a drummer. So I met a Baba Lawo. He was a high priest in that system, Baba Ason that day. And he was like, I need you to drum for these. Like, just, you picked up the music really well. And he just kept inviting me to ceremonies. And so I would just, maybe about a year, I was just drumming for ceremonies. The more I would do it, the more curious I would become. And eventually to the point of wanting to like learn the technology, right? The science and and the magic behind the rituals. So that's how I got into it. And as I was studying it, it what I became really interested in and really impressed by wasn't just like the performance of the ceremony, but the analysis of our ancestors that was documented through the code of this particular system, Ifa, and its ability to transcend what I had understood was possible through spirituality, just by being able to be in direct communication with God through Orisha, through ancestors, through the technology of the drums and the divination. Um, and and as I was kind of just reflecting on the level of access I had, which was kind of like a unique backdoor, sneaky way to get into this world. It just kept hitting me that so many Black people needed this, right? And I think we're all relatively aware of the, the propaganda about African spiritual systems. Voodoo in particular has a very intentional smear campaign, right? And I saw it coming up, and it impacted me in the same way that I think it impacts lots of people, where you hear something is demonic or backwards or primitive, and you're like, okay, yeah, I'm gonna stay away from that. The worshiping false idols. So I still had my religious training in me from going to church, and I still watched TV, and I saw the voodoo dolls, and I saw the zombie. I see even watching cartoons, you see like um the cannibal in the villages, they're boiling people in pots, the bones in
Mhm.
their nose. And so like all that propaganda made me not want to be associated with this thing that I was taught was demonic. And so the more I understood through directly experiencing Vodun and Ifa and Yoruba and Santeria and Lukumi and Candomblé, and these expressions of this Yoruba tradition, um, and other traditions, other African indigenous traditions, I got to directly experience the beauty and the peace and the wisdom and the type of like ancestral value system that could help us right now. And then it clicked for me that the reason that an adversary, an oppressor, a colonizer would want to strip us of the power and the medicine and the beauty of our systems was because they knew that if we had them, we would be more powerful. And so that's becomes the inspiration for a book or sharing information. Period. Like if I'm getting sort of the secret access to this information, then I have to give it to my family and to my friends and to people who don't even know that they don't know that there's a whole world of values and science that we've been locked out of through the propaganda of the brainwashing and the psychological warfare that happens to make us think that our stuff is wrong and that somebody else's stuff is pristine and that we need to move away from it. But instead, I learned that we need to go towards it and that it connected me to this larger conversation, my larger work around healing. So if I'm a psychologist or a healer or a facilitator of, restoration and repair in any way, then this part of it, the spiritual part of it, has to be included in how I understood what generational trauma meant, and also then what the antidote to that is. And at the beginning of it, it's just correcting the information. And so
Uh,
that's where the book came from. Just wanted to correct the information.
Dr. Abari, you don't just mind taking us in the different step on collecting. What was the procedure on collecting information um, to bring the book into life? What
Um,
what do you have to do?
Great question. So the my entry into the Yoruba system was through drums, but eventually I became a true student of the system. And so that Baba Lawo, Baba Song became my teacher. And so he would have classes. Um, I started to ask lots of questions and take lots of notes and record him speaking. And he would do lectures. Sometimes I would help coordinate some public sort of presentations. Um, so that was it. It was several years of me sort of studying his work. And he came from a lineage of practitioners. His grandfather was one of the pioneering African spiritual sort of practitioners in the country, Baba Metahelchi. And so he has a wealth of wisdom that he sort of inherited through his bloodline that I was tapped into. And so we would spend hours and hours and hours and hours just talking and taking notes and just studying him. And what was interesting about our perspectives was that he grew up in this, like this is his life. But I came into it as an adult. So I still had doubts. I still had lots of questions. He would have to like explain things to me from scratch, right? Because I don't know, talking about using language. He would speak Yoruba and phone. Like he knew several different languages. And so I would have to slow him down and like explain this to me like I'm a child. And because of that, I got really detailed explanations and ability to be able to communicate to people like me who were coming in from scratch. So it was him. He was my guide. He was my teacher, my mentor, um, my Babalawo, my spiritual leader. He was all of that. And then he passed. Um,
Mhm.
and so part of the book was a tribute to him and this this transmission of culture that I just felt obligated to continue to share in my own way. I thought I would have him for decades more. So, there was things that I wish I documented that I didn't, but I had enough to share. And so I wanted to honor his role in my life and to invite other people to be a part of a process that was very special and meaningful, that I thought had implications for, you know, healing practices beyond um, the work that I was personally doing.
I see. Eventually, you wrote the book and
Mhm.
call it Black Spirituality. Why the title?
Excellent question. I don't get to explain that often. Because part of my intention, and I'm still kind of finding my audiences, but I know to a certain extent that it is people who are curious about what other explanations there are out there to why we are here and what are the spiritual sort of cosmologies that exist. Um, I meet a lot of people who have church hurt, who are, disappointed with their experiences with Christianity or Islam, and sort of the influence of human and the major religions and politics and power, I think leave people disgruntled in some ways. Um, and so particularly the younger people I meet, they kind of like over church. I mean, a lot of people who are just like, oh. That's my grandma stuff. And but still have the questions and are still having to figure out how to be human and how to, be with each other. And in lieu of a place to find answers to questions about like, why we here and what happens afterwards and how do we get help and those, I mean, very basic living questions. I see a lot of people like going to Google and just finding themselves making stuff up. I think a lot of people find themselves going into what they have access to, which might mean, trying to study tarot or Buddhism or hoodoo, stuff, very, very powerful systems. Um, but what I find often is when people are just using the internet to look for spiritual systems, that there is a lot of manipulation that happens, a lot of misinformation that happens. And we still never, in large part, have dealt with the disconnect from Africa and the propagandizing of African systems. And so what that has meant is even if you hear people talk about like a collective unifying spiritual system, I was at a Baha'i event the other day and they were talking about just the Baha'i being an expression, a new iteration of other religions, but they all one, like all of it is one thing. And they were mentioning different religions, but they always omit the African ones. There's still an omission of African indigenous faiths and our collective imagination of how do we explain things that seems intentional. It seems like there's something about that I'm aware of the resistance to it, and I know what happened to us, and I know why we are afraid of certain things. And so, if my audience are people who I know are seeking something, but I also know that there are certain blocks to it, I wanted to offer a framework that was more inviting, that was more open. And I know if I called it African spirituality, I would lose people who needed it because there's something about African spirituality that triggers a fear response. But Black spirituality opens a way to say well, there might be something because I'm Black and I'm curious about spirituality. And when I say ancient, it allows for an easier connection to indigenous African than just putting African on it at the top. So it is about African spirituality and it is about applying some of the things that I learned about African spirituality to the current context of Black American experiences. And so it's not just about like going way back in time and recreating African societies. It's about applying those principles to what does it mean to be a Black man in a Trump regime? Like what does it mean to in current context to live the day-to-day lives of raising I got two children, of raising them in America, paying taxes. Like until I decide to leave, I'm here. And while we are here, there's things that we have to struggle with that are racial, that are political, that are social and economic, that have to do with the conditions of the societies we've set up. And so I sought a perspective on spirituality that merged these realities, this ancient African indigenous reality with current Black context. Um, and so the Black spirituality serves both of those purposes. It allowed me to talk about spirituality in social political terms, but also open the way to people who may have been afraid or resistant to something called African spirituality on its head.
Yeah. I truly believe as an author, writing a book for me is a kind of a journey
Yeah.
you go through, and the journey have different steps. And
Hmm.
those steps often reflect um, the way you want to address the issue and the solution you want to offer. When we go deep into your book, what are the different parts or the different chapters of your book? Or how many chapters do you have in your book?
Do I have my book on there? So here's the book for anyone that has not
Black
seen the cover.
spirituality, yeah.
Yes.
Ancient wisdom to heal generational trauma.
Um, One thing that was important to me as I was writing was to write it with a level of humility. Um, so 11 chapters, what you'll read as you go through this journey with me are sort of me unfolding the process as I experienced it. It's very personal, right? So I don't write this as like I figured this thing out and I'm descending upon a mountaintop to pass it along to the masses. I write it very much as a student, as a person still on a journey. It's not the final word. Um, I was I'm still going back and reading it and making edits. It's not even done. I don't even know what it means to be done, right? Um, because I'm growing and I'm learning and I'm experiencing new things and new insights. And the beauty of putting it out in the world allowed me to have conversations with other people to see how they're receiving it and what mattered to them and what might be confusing to them. And so it's important to me just in any conversation. I considered a conversation. I had something to say. You have a response to it, and now I want to make sure that I'm saying it in a way that's as clear as possible. I don't want to be confusing or esoteric. I don't want to be over your head. I want it to be. I want you to receive it as intended, which is, you know, this is what I got from this so far, and this is how it's been useful in my life. And maybe it could be something that you could use also. And so it reads like that. It reads like a conversation. Um, and I talk about some of my own personal stuff. I talk a lot about Baba Ason. As much as often I include his direct words in bold. So it's all you also get to hear from him. And you get to see us in conversation. And you get to still see me wrestling with things that he taught that I didn't agree with. I don't teach this as like a this is what it is and you accept it or not. I teach it. I talk about spirituality, particularly my angle on this, as something that I still carry doubts about. I still like, I don't know if that makes sense to me. Right. And so I offer that in writing, um, which I've heard some people not love. Right. I had a very specific response from an elder of mine who said he wanted to read something that was more definitive so that he could respond to it. But because I was asking questions throughout, that was unsettling for him. But that's a part of it. Like it's I'm very clear about my doubt, right? Um, and so I had to be honest about that. I'm still there are things that come that have happened. I've had experiences through this system that made me question it in real time. And so I've landed in a place where, for now, like I've landed in a place for now where I think there's a lot of value to this. And there's also still a lot of human interruption. There's still a lot of um, questions about piecing together things from another time and place where some of the technologies, the rituals, and the analysis is has been coded just like I consider any of the religious texts for a time and place that needs to be revised and applied to current context. And there's always questions when you do that. There's always like it's not like a list of commandments that you can just lift and take anywhere in the world at any time. It's a conversation always, and so I very much believe in spirituality being a guide for a relationship with the Creator and the powers that be and our ancestors that is a real time, ongoing conversation. So I write it in that way, where you get to see me wrestling with things, and invite you into a process, and hopefully people take that and find it useful, and it inspires them to be on their own journey in their own process in their own relationship with their ancestors and their spirit guides. But I never wanted it to be a final word. Well, okay, this is what I should do now. This is what I'm supposed to do. It's more of an invitation to a process, a journey that I'm still on. And felt like I had enough to share to continue.
As you indicated, Black spirituality, um, is it is quite a journey, and I'm wondering whether the journey is a group journey or an individual one.
I think both. I think there are times when we need to have our own time to go. And I do, I often will find myself sitting by the lake, listening to myself, my intuition, my ori, the water, the wind, the ground, the sky. These are all things that represent aspects of divine forces and manifestations that have been named through deities in different pantheons around the world, but are very much nature based and real and evolving, right? And so the concept of God that I was taught by Baba Ason was that God is an ever evolving entity. It's not a fixed thing. It's learning as we learning. It's growing as we growing. And so that means it requires us to do both. I think to go within, to spend time in meditation, to spend time listening very deeply, but then to share what insights we got so that we can, through community, through the collective power of the wisdom of sort of the different perspectives that come together when people gather, um, elevate the individual perspectives that we have. So I think both are necessary. I think we need to spend time alone, reading, writing, journaling, listening, meditating, just being. And then we also have to, in community, study together. And then the most important part, I would argue, is to take the things that we learned individually and collectively to apply them to service, to elevating, to liberating, to evolving in very intentional ways, and then go back to repeat that cycle. So I had an insight, I shared it with the group, we shaped it together, we put that into action, we evaluated the impact of that action, and now I go back to say, how do I feel about that? Was that effective? And how do I define that effectiveness? And then to continue to repeat that cycle over and over again until I don't know, maybe forever.
In your front page, you indicated ancient wisdom.
Yeah.
You don't mind sharing few ancient wisdom that you learn along your education, your research.
Yeah. Um, I love the like the real time expression of what we were just discussing. So like you ask a question, and I think that happens through persons or individually. Sometimes a question will come to me, or a question will come from someone. And like I think the first step is to like pause and like just hear it, like to really fully hear it. And what happens next for me, and it's become very intentional for me, is to like remove myself from the process as much as possible, and then just open up to listening to those ancestors and spirits and deities and expressions of God that I very much believe stay with me, and ask them to contribute to the response, right? So that it's not my brain and my neurons firing. It's really just me submitting to a process of being a vessel, of being aware of the truth, which is that we all vibrating energies that are expressions of the Most High Creator, the Great Mystery. However, we describe it. We are in real time manifestations of that. This is a walking prayer. This conversation is just a sacred moment that everything is if we submit to that. And so what comes to me as I just sort of describe that and do that and answer the question is one of those things of those sort of points of ancient wisdom that comes to mind immediately is that there is a very like incomprehensible, because of the limits of our human brain and body, um, amount of like space time, like when I think about how old this experience is, how old not even just us as a people are, but like or the planet or the universe, it's incomprehensible. And I like to watch space shows. I like to like follow the Neil deGrasse Tyson guys. Like I like to there's the spiritual stuff and then there's the science stuff, and for me it's all the same. Like it's all connected. But one of those pieces of ancient wisdom that sticks with me is the vastness of possibilities and information, all of it being limited by me trying to answer a question to describe it that is filtered through language that is incomplete. So I'm always in constant awe of like us just grasping little pieces of so much vastness that we can use just to make it through the days. But what I've really appreciated about the ancient wisdom that is stored in the systems of, Yoruba is what I've spent most time studying, is all of the doctrines, all of the like the pieces of information that I've gathered speak to the I'm using the word the universe, but which is an English codified, like it's not even, it doesn't even comprehend the vastness of this, the actual thing that is the universe. The word the universe doesn't convey that. But it's all I have to be able to try to point to this idea that there's so much and it's so big and it's so old and it's so expansive. And when I recognize that wisdom and when I humble myself to that reality, um, it makes me feel so simultaneously small but valuable, which allows me to have a really like I feel like an accurate perspective of the day-to-day problems that I encounter, the things that make me depressed or anxious. Um, and so the very succinct sort of response is there's a wisdom that I've learned from sort of the ancients, from our ancestors. And when I say ancestors, that word is so limiting to like I'm so aware of the limits of the words. So when I think ancestors, I don't just think Martin Luther King or my great grandfather. We're talking about generations and generations of people that go back beyond the name that I could even try to recall. But I think that they had a sense of the vastness of their beingness that if we can connect to that, that there's a insight that we can gain that helps us now that for me gives me a lot of reassurance. It makes me feel powerful in a way that I think is important in a moment when sometimes I feel weak or I feel like we spend a lot of time talking about like white people and what they've done to us or what Trump or the administration is doing. I think we can get really caught up in the day to days and the social political realities. And I think we have to a certain degree. But when I can release those things and just submerge, I went swimming yesterday in Lake Michigan, and I was aware of as I was in this sort of this. I was trying my best to not use any of the words. So like I wasn't submersed through water. Like water is just I don't know what is water. Like what is that word water? Um, but I was just in this thing in this body, looking at the sky. The moon was red, and I could hear my children's sort of voice, and sort of this the moment of beingness connected me to a wisdom of the vastness that gave me a level of peace that is unshakable. It's just not that I could only I gave away when I went back to my car and got back on my phone. Like I gave that peace and power away. So part of the wisdom that I've gathered through this analysis, through the understanding of the design of the universe and our place in it, is that there's a lot of peace and power that we can access through submitting and humility and through connecting to something so much bigger and larger than we can even comprehend, but we can try to. through some of the rituals that we've inherited, and amend them as needed. And that is the essence of the journey. That all the other things are trappings, they're superficial, that they're like distractions in some ways. And we got to eat and we got to pay bills and all that kind of stuff. But there's something underneath and above and within all of that that my ancestors remind me of through the ritual of drumming and singing and connecting to something that is older than I could even comprehend.
You also indicated generational trauma.
Yeah.
You don't mind citing few generational trauma you believe Africans or African American um, communities are facing?
Yeah. So my definition of generational trauma is more expansive than I think that we're using it. I think you hear the word now. Um, and people might be referring their grandma being mean and us being like secretive in the house or us passing down the levels of toxicity in our families, certainly post enslavement. But part of how I describe the generational trauma includes the separation. It includes outlawing drums. It includes, um, if we got caught doing any of this stuff, ring shouts or gathering in the hush harbors or speaking our languages or playing our instruments or any aspect, any remnants of our cultural power, that there was a violent response to that. So it's not that we forgot this stuff. It's not that it just slipped our mind over time. That there was when we were found in during enslavement, doing things that an oppressor either didn't understand or did understand and knew the power of. There was deliberate attempts to disconnect those things. And so when I think about that trauma, the severing, the traumatic, like um, the violent removal of a people from their ways. They had practiced it with the indigenous people of this place, right? Through the boarding schools, through the churning them through a machine of taking someone that, from someone's perspective, they saw as primitive or um, uncivilized, right? There's so much violence and trauma that happens to take someone's language and drums and rituals and spirituality from them. And so, as a healer, I know that my training in psychology to be a therapist is very limited in helping people cope and manage and go back to work and be more efficient cogs in a machine. And even if I expand that to generational trauma, I might be getting people to do a family tree and a genogram and get them to think about what patterns they saw in their house, in their grandmothers and grandfathers' houses. But if we don't extend that back to the original trauma, which included the forced removal of people from their homeland, and then the constant violent removal of their ways, their cultural, their heritage, their food, that part of the healing of that generational trauma has to be put those things back in place. And so for a long time, a lot of my therapy was using drums. We would do drum therapy, right? So instead of just sitting around and talking, we would reintroduce the drum back into people and communities. And, a lot of times with people that had never seen a drum or played a drum. But once they did, there was a memory that comes back that allows a access to a healing possibilities that talking doesn't do. Some of the trauma we got is stored in our blood and bones. It got to be sweated out. It's got to use movement, and that's why art and creativity is so important for this. Because if we're doing cultural art, so African centered art, it reconnects us to a power that was severed from us that allows for that very type of generational trauma to be restored and repaired. So we've been doing that, and there are practices around using drum and dance and movement and yoga and those kind of things. I do a comedic yoga with Black men every Sunday. Um, and so to be able to be in poses and movements and using breath work and connecting that to ancient practices that are still sort of carved into the eternity in architecture back in Egypt. Those things allow for a time travel, a sort of really deep reconnection. So this new sort of work allows for that to be done on a spiritual level, which has been very powerful for me. So that's what I mean when I say generational trauma. I mean that there is a organized, violent effort for generations to disconnect us from ourselves through culture and to replace those things that were medicinal and powerful for us with a corporate, capitalized, commodified, distorted version of culture from someone else's perspective to convince us that that is what wellness and success is supposed to be. And that is happening through the mental health institutions that we are required to go to for licenses and for accreditation. And that those things are fundamentally not even just flawed, but designed for a maintenance of a level of sickness through hierarchy that is inundated, that we are swimming in, in large part have no idea.
As you
So that's when I think generational trauma, that's what comes to mind.
as you indicated in the book, you have 11 chapters in the book. Those those 11 chapters, do they have a subtitle? And if they are subtitled, you don't mind just briefly allowing us to hear those subtitles so we can have an idea on the topic you were trying to basically, you know, enlighten people in.
Yeah, sure thing. Just quickly, the first is I have an introduction, kind of do a framework. Then I talk about Baba Ason. So I introduce him. I talk about language, ancestors, the concept of God, our relationship with the concept of God, elements of African spirituality, community healing and justice, the spirituality of self. Then I tell my personal story. I talk about how I came into it. And then the last section is called Continued Discovery, where I have a list of questions that I still have. So I end the book with discovery.
Mm,
So I make it very clear that this is not the final word, that there are things that I'm still struggling with, and I include those things at the end.
I see. Can you, as you indicated, you didn't when you wrote your book, you share um stories about yourself, about your mentors, and you didn't come up with this is the solution. You
Hmm.
just open a door at the
Yeah.
end to ask question. Can you share a few questions you ask to yourself and you projected to the audience to reflect on them?
Yes. Let me see if this opens to a quick question that I could share. I do have a couple of questions here in the end around race. Um, I think that one of the struggles with spirituality being filtered through our human condition is that some of the things that we have created as humans get like stuck in the spiritual concepts. So we've been talking about this thing being African spirituality, and we've discussed a little bit about the struggles with language, and that includes African. As some scholars would say that that is a that the word African, the label African itself, is not indigenous to Africa. There are people who have searched for other expressions to speak to the common label for the continent. Al-Kabulan is one that comes to mind. Um, there's some scholars say African is the name of a Italian general of Africa or something like that. And so every time, so we are attempting to go back to the source and to give it its own power and to remind ourselves of what we're capable of. But even in the language of saying the thing African, there's a wound expressed in that. Certainly in Black, right? Black is just a racial concept that was created, and you can think about it coming through a laboratory and someone trying to divide people, and you know, and so to maintain either of those phrases, African or Black, comes with a level of human baggage. Um, and so when I think about one of the questions that I ask is whether or not that limited human social interaction extends to our conceptualization of spirit in ways where we think of the Yoruba faith, the Yoruba spiritual system, as being uniquely African and for African descendants, um, while at the same time, in the faith, they describe these deities, Oshun, Shango, Obatala, Ogun, as primordial beings that were there at the beginning of the universe. They are a part of the fabric of the existence period. So we're talking about beings that predated all of the expressions, the planets and the plants, and certainly the people. Um, and so sometimes I struggle with what I think becomes a lot of gatekeeping, uh, pride. I don't know. Sometimes I think capitalism requires a level of like ownership, and there are debates still ongoing about to what level we open up these systems and invite the diversity of people into them versus protecting them and maintaining them for African descendants. Um, so let's say if we are worshiping, praying to, doing rituals for a goddess like Oshun, who is a deity who represents attraction and beauty and wisdom and fertility, that these are all concepts that belong to all humans. Um, and if that deity was a deity that existed at the beginning of the universe's history, is in the fabric, then some of the things that I ask about is to why would the Oshun not also have an investment in the Europeans? Like, why is she ours? If she existed before any humans existed. And so then does a German person carry Oshun with them? Or are there other indigenous gods to the German tradition that they should be worshiping? And now are we thinking about like just the extension of heaven and earth, mimicking how we have divided people along social, political, racial lines here? Um, and I wonder sometimes if we limit our imagination because of our human experiences, but we say ancestors and we think Black ancestors, but like white people got ancestors too, um, and all of them can't have all been evil and demonic. And certainly, some of them have done harm, but um, I think that there's a lot of division between like the representation of Oshun being a Black woman, which feels good, it makes sense, um, but it also feels like the same limits of me watching a god in a cartoon being an old white man with beard descending from the sky. So this idea that there's a human connection to a god making us in his or her or its image that is still human, um, but limited by our human experiences. And if we do ourselves a disservice by managing and packaging and contorting our the universal understanding of power of spirituality through a human lens. So some of those things I struggle with, I wrestle with. I wrestle with like even the idea of calling God him or her, genderizing a God, calling it is so unpersonal. It's so, distant. We like a personal God, but if we're talking about a being that is beyond comprehension, but we attempt to comprehend it through our lens, then I wonder what we lose. Like I wonder how we limit ourselves. Um, and if spirituality is supposed to expand, then sometimes I think we might be missing out.
So, as an author, what are the challenges usually you face on trying to spread the word of your ideas, on trying to help people?
Man, it's
And
tough.
mm,
Um, I think that we have a hard time with literacy, period. It's not even personal. I think that
mm,
people don't have time to read.
mm,
I'm having a struggle right now. So before I even, so this the book is, I call it a soft launch. Like I just got to a place where I wanted to get out this version that I had and begin the conversation, just to get people's feedback and insight and to be able to just host events. But I'm still working on it. I'm still making edits, and I still don't have it on all the platforms, which is a dilemma by itself. Like whether I'm trying to reclaim this ancient African spiritual tradition, but then put it on Amazon, like that. Some of that just feels incongruent with the principles that I'm trying to speak to. Um, and I had a PDF version before I was printing them that I sent to a friend, and she was really excited to, receive the content. But, I think people are used to multitasking. And so she immediately put it through her app, which read the book out loud to her. And the only Black voice on her app was Snoop Dogg. And so she sent me a video of her listening to my book through Snoop Dogg's AI voice. And it just didn't feel right. Like it just, that wasn't my intention. That wasn't when I was, spent years crafting a story, right? I didn't imagine it coming back to me through Snoop Dogg's voice. And so one of the things that I struggle with is just the access, putting it on the platforms, giving it to, the more you digitize it, the more AI can get it and chop it up. And um, I know people are busy, and so they want to listen to it in their car. I have to think about whether or not I want to record it myself so it can be available through my voice. And then I'm speaking by my son's voice, which I don't necessarily feel comfortable with. So the technology I'm struggling with, but also, you know, just giving it away on platforms. I'm self-publishing for now, but still people, and it's a give and take. This is my second book. And so the first book that I did, I wanted to make sure like it was all only in Black hands, only in Black bookstores. It wasn't on Amazon, but I limited the reach. So if I'm saying I got information I want to share, but then you got to find my website to share it, then even that is a contradiction. And so there's lots of dilemmas in the distribution, um, and meeting the challenge of just the moment that people have a lot to do, and trying to make it easy and accessible and all of that. But doing it with something that feels so sacred. It'd be different if it feels like a novel, if it was just for fun. But this feels like my intention was that I want people to sit and be quiet and read carefully and open themselves up to their own ancestors and their own conversations with their own spirit guides. And it's hard to do that where you're doing three things. It's not a multitasking kind of a book for me.
mm, mm.
Um, but if that means people don't get it, because I'm only gonna have it on my website or in Black bookstores, then that gets in the way of the mission, which isn't to like make a lot of money, but to share this historical ancient wisdom that has been kept from us, and I want to give it back to people. But if I have to do that in a way that considers where people are, where people get information, and sometimes that's just hard to do.
I see. Dr. Abari, thank you very much
No,
for
thank you for
taking
yeah
your
for
time and sharing about your book. I know this is your second book, maybe in the near future when the opportunity come, I would love to invite you again to talk about your first book. Um, if people wanna buy your books, where should they go?
so right now this is only on my website. I'm probably gonna eventually give in and put it on the platforms in a couple
Mm.
of months. But right now it's just on my website,
And
drobaricartman.com.
okay. Again, thank you very much for joining me under the human right tree. And it was a pleasure talking to you and talking about your book.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
All right, take care.
All right, you too.
Bye.